Welcome to the Four Witnesses of the Messiah, Chapter 4, Session 13A, the Galilean Ministry. We will now return to our event-by-event harmony. The Sermon on the Mount was Event 4.12. So, we're going to restart our numbering after that. Jesus is still in the midst of his sweep through Galilee, visiting towns and speaking in synagogues. His ministry will build upon the momentum from the Sermon on the Mount. Simultaneous to this, the Pharisees realize how formidable his movement is, so they ramped up their efforts to stop it. But Jesus was walking by the Spirit and was prevailing. So the next event is Event 4.13, the healing of the leper. Look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 1. Matthew chapter 8, verse 1. It says, when he was come down from the mountain. So this is immediately after the Sermon on the Mount. Great multitudes followed him. And behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. So he willed it and he was clean. No, sorry. But anyway, and Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So this was right after the Sermon on the Mount. Leprosy was the scourge of that era. It was greatly feared. Those suspected of having that disease were strictly quarantined. So when Jesus touched him, when he touched that leper, it shocked everybody, and probably even including the leper himself. Jesus' bold believing was remarkable. Today, even though humanity has made great advances in medical science, there still are formidable and feared diseases, especially in poorer countries. But we who are in more affluent countries seem to have fallen under the spell of science, and it has become more difficult for us to believe for miraculous healings. But those who have visited Sangat Bain's ministry, for example, in India, have witnessed great healings. And they wonder why we haven't seen similar things here. Well, they do still occur, praise the Lord. Our minds are capable of the same believing as theirs. The difference that I see is that their culture in India is more God-centered than ours. Therefore, the same things that work over there will not work here. And vice versa. Different culture. For example, most people here can read. Over there, not so much. So the ministry there have accommodated in India in a way that is unnecessary and might even be inappropriate here. But that's why the body of Christ is congregational. It's divided along culture and subcultural lines. But believing still works everywhere. So I declare, never give in and never give up. Keep believing to be healed. And if you're following the medical route, well, that's not a cop-out. It's your body. It's your believing. It's your decision. I don't care how you get the baby. I just want to see the baby, okay? So, look at Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, verse 40. There came a leper to him, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him, and saying to him, Lord, if you wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand, and touched him, and said unto him, I will, be thou clean. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. Now, He was moved with compassion. In my Leadership in the Body of Christ book, I talk about the necessity of compassion. It is a trigger. It comes from your heart. It comes from the same place that your spiritual heart is. Many times, God reaches out, and the go sign is compassion. So, if we're compassionate, we're on the right track. And it's just amazing. One of my other teachings, The Missing Ministries of Mercy, I show how being moved with compassion was the precursor to many miracles. But here in Mark 1, Jesus in verse 43 straightly charged him and sent him away forthwith. But that was an unusual move. Well, Jesus charged him. Well, what was that for? Luke has more information. Luke chapter 5, verse 12. Luke 5:12. It came to pass, when he was in a certain city, behold, a man full of leprosy, who, seeing Jesus, fell on his face. So he came down from the mountain on the Sermon on the Mount and went into a city. So that's when more information about this. And he said, if Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And so Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately the leprosy departed from him. And he charged him to tell no man, but go, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing, according as Moses commanded, for a testimony unto them. All right, well, one thing Jesus told him to do was to go to the priest. The priests had been instructed in the Bible how to diagnose whether somebody was cured of leprosy. So, in order to be admitted back into society, the man had to go to the priest to be diagnosed. But there was something else that Jesus told him. He said, see that thou tell no man. Matthew 8:4 also documents this. Matthew 8:4, Jesus said, see thou tell no man, but go thy way, show yourself to the priest, offer the gift. Mark 1:44, Jesus also said, and said to him, see thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest. Verse 45, Mark 1:45, says that the man went out and began to publish it. He disobeyed what Jesus said, and to blaze it abroad, the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city. Now, ordinarily, when someone's healed, it's told far and wide to give glory to God. God should be glorified, yes, but sometimes wisdom intervenes. See, being healed of leprosy was so sensational because this disease was so feared. And also, it says in Luke 5:12 that this guy was full of leprosy. So this was in an advanced stage. And then, of course, it says the healing was immediate. So that was spectacular. But Jesus told the man to keep it to himself. Well, he didn't, and because he didn't, the crowds were so large, they became unmanageable, and Jesus could no longer minister in cities. He had to stay out in the country where there was more space. Event 4:14 talks about this. Event 4:14. The overwhelming crowds in Mark 1:45b, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but was without in desert places, and they came to him from every direction. And then Luke 5:15, but so much the more went there a fame abroad of him, and great multitudes came together to hear, and to be healed by them of their infirmities. So, Because the man did not follow Jesus' advice, Jesus had to minister out of town in the countryside. Now, there are a number of things left unsaid in the Bible that we know had to occur. For example, Jesus and his entourage had to eat, right? They had to sleep somewhere, right? There were things that had to be organized. So, there were supplies and resources and personnel for his ministry that had to be coordinated. They had to put the show on the road. And being able to come to a town and minister certainly was easier than having to set everything up out in the countryside. But now that was the only thing they could do. It also affected who could be reached. For example, elderly people who needed healing who were in town might not be able to make it out into the countryside. So you can imagine the dynamics of his outreach had to change. The mechanics of his ministry had to be adjusted. So, do you see why Jesus told the man to keep it to himself? But they still managed, and Jesus conducted his ministry work in the countryside instead. So, then we get to chapter 5 of Luke 5:16, and he withdrew himself into the wilderness and prayed. Jesus often resorted to prayer, and that speaks volumes. Leaders must pray a lot. It's their oasis in the midst of turmoil. It's their anchor of commitment. It's their power base of vigor. The next event is event 4.15. Jesus returns to Capernaum. And we go to Mark chapter 2 for that one. Mark chapter 2, verse 1a. And again, he entered into Capernaum. So, finally, after a while, he could come back to his base of operations in Capernaum. This event is one of the places where Matthew is not chronological. Brood, Stalker, and Cummins all say so. Walter Cummins, in his book, Acceptable Year of the Lord, has a lengthy explanation. Well, why isn't it chronological? Well, in short, that's the author's preference, isn't it? There are many legitimate reasons why things may be presented out of chronological sequence. Ren Minetti has taught us about parentheses in the Gospel of John. Well, that's a form of digression. Another divergence could be to momentarily follow a tangent to fully finish a subject before returning to a normal chronological sequence. Well, in order to discern such things, one must pay close attention to the connective and introductory words of the verses in the passage. Another reason is a passage could have a type of sequence based upon some other structure other than time. For example, Matthew's structure is built around portraying Jesus as the king. Matthew's structures for this part of the book is noted on page 1823 in the Companion Bible, and titled Matthew 8:1 through 16:13, the second period of the ministry, the proclamation of the king. Since the portrayal of Jesus as king is the main theme of Matthew, that structure surely can take precedence over chronology. Luke, on the other hand, stated in his introduction that he would write his account in order, that is, in chronological order. So Luke is who we've been following primarily. Mark seems to follow along too. And then portions skipped in Matthew chapter 8 will fit back in beside their corresponding events in Luke when they occur later. So this is what Luke said in chapter 1, verse 3. He said, "It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order. That's in chronological order. Most excellent Theophilus. So, I've taken that as a guideline in fitting together the harmony. So, next event 4.16, titled, They Came In Through the Roof. Luke 5:17 through 26. Luke chapter 5. It came to pass on a certain day, as Jesus was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. Wow, that's that green light that's talked about. You just know, and you keep your eye peeled for opportunities, and boom, you move when God says. So, verse 18, and behold, men brought in a bed a man which was taken with the palsy, and they sought means to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. And when they could not find by what way they might bring him in, because of the multitude, they went upon the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. Oh, you can imagine that. And when he saw their faith, he said to them, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. Now, the houses of that era had openings in the roof for smoke to go out, for ventilation, which could also be covered with something, like when it rained. So they did not break a hole in the roof. They just uncovered that hole with whatever is covering it and let the man down into the room where Jesus was. Wow, they were very determined to get to Jesus, weren't they? That indicated their believing. And Jesus responded by ministering to the man and healing him. But in this situation, there was something else involved. Jesus discerned the cause and told the man, quote, Thy sins are forgiven thee. Now we go on in Luke chapter 5, verse 21. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this that speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? But when Jesus perceived their thoughts, God told him what their thoughts were. He answered and said unto them, What reason ye in your hearts? What is easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee? Or to say, Rise up and walk? Well, that's just as hard to do either one. They both require revelation. Verse 24, But that you may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he said to the sick of the palsy, I say to you, arise, take up your couch, and go into your house. So he said, okay, I'll prove it. And he healed him. Woo! And immediately he rose up. The guy rose up, took up his whereupon would he lay, and departed to his own house, glorifying God. And they were all amazed. And they glorified God and were filled with reverence, saying, We've seen strange things today. Now, the Gospel of Mark follows Luke at this point. Mark chapter 2, verse 1. Mark chapter 2. And this has the same incident with the man that was let down through the hole in the roof. Okay? And so they had the same result. They were amazed when he was healed. But now let's go down to Matthew. Matthew does chime in, but it's after it skips all the rest of chapter 8. Because Matthew at this point is not chronological while Luke is. And the introductory words in Matthew chapter 9, verse 2 are, And behold. Those are not temporal in nature, so there can be a time break. So that's why the passage in Matthew can be handled out of chronological order. Matthew chapter 9, verse 2, Behold, they brought to him a man sick of the palsy. So here is the same incident in Matthew chapter 9, in verse 8, after Jesus healed him, he arose, departed to his house. The multitude saw it, and they marveled and glorified God, who had given such power unto men. Now, but remember, Jesus told him, your sins are forgiven thee. Now, there is often, not always, but often, a relationship between sin and sickness. And this is one of the follow-up tasks that one must do when ministering. Okay? Like, remember when you prophesy until it's done. Or when you interpret until it's done. Okay? Well, when you minister until it's done. And one of the follow-up tasks is to follow through. After the healing is finished, follow through, and you ask God, is there anything else? Because sometimes God will give you advice to give to the person. Okay? And Jesus did that. He often gave advice afterwards. So, when you're ministering healing and the revelation stops for the ministering part, don't just wrap up and go home. Ask God, is there anything else? What caused this, etc. And sometimes God will tell you there may be stuff to follow through. And in this case, the guy's sin was a problem. So, Jesus took care of it. Next event 4.17. There's a teaching by the seaside in Mark 2:13, where it says in Mark 2:13, he went forth again by the seaside, and all the multitudes resorted unto him, and he taught them. Now, Rood and Stalker have this event next, but Walter Cummins does not. Event 4.18 is the next event, which is the calling of Matthew. There's some speculation whether Levi is another name for Matthew, or whether Jesus invited two tax collectors, another tax collector besides Matthew. I'm of the opinion that they are the same, because there are several apostles who had more than one name. But let's go to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, verse 27. Luke chapter 5, verse 27. And after these things he went forth and saw a publican, a tax collector, named Levi, sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, follow me. And he left all, rose up, and followed him. Matthew 9:9 is another record of it. Matthew 9, verse 9. And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, follow me. And he arose and followed him. And then Mark 2:14 is the other one. Mark chapter 2, verse 14. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom, and said unto him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. So, that's the calling of Matthew. But next, we're entering a difficult section of the harmony. And now, you and I have all tried to put together puzzles, right? You get the box out, and you open up the puzzle box, and what do? Well, you dump out all the contents onto the table and just stare at it, right? Well, how do we begin to assemble that jumble of puzzle pieces? Oh, all right, wait. No cheating. You can't look at the picture on the box to see what the end result's going to be. Oh, no. No, you can't do that. So how do you proceed now? That's the situation here, because we do not have the benefit of having the completed picture to go from. So how do we proceed with this puzzle? One logical strategy for step number 1 is to sort all the light-colored puzzle pieces together into piles. Then step number 2 is you start to assemble them. And in order to do that, we got to inspect the connections between the pieces and see how they fit. And then step number 3, good old trial and error. You try them on for size and think things through. So, step number 4, of course, the picture on the pieces need to fit. No forcing pieces together. That's not allowed, because the result will be distorted if you're allowed to do that. So, at this point in the harmony, this puzzle deepens. There are several events which we must put in the correct sequence, and in order to do so, we need to pay attention to the connections between them. As I mentioned earlier, the sequence of the content in the book is the author's prerogative. We all have gone off on tangents on our discourses, so we certainly should allow the gospel writers to do so. One of the guiding rules of this harmony has been that Luke said he wrote in order, that is, in chronological sequence. But we even need to allow Luke to go off on a tangent if he wants to, in order to develop or finish a topic. And I think this is what we probably have here. Here are the events, beginning with the call of the tax collectors. Levi and Matthew, or Levi, which is another name for Matthew. That event 4.18 follows immediately after the healing of the man that was let down through the roof, because Matthew records as Jesus passed forth from thence, and Mark concurs, quote, as he passed by. And Luke also says, quote, after these things he went forth. So, therefore, events 4.17 and 4.18 are connected. Then, Matthew chapter 9, 10 through 13, Mark chapter 2, 15 through 22, and Luke 5, 39, all describe a feast that was held at Levi, the tax collector's house. After that, Matthew gives the incident regarding the ruler whose daughter had died, and ties it straight into what Jesus was teaching at Levi's feast, quote, while he yet spake these things. Then, while Jesus was going to the ruler's house, Matthew 9:20 through 22 talks about the woman with the issue of blood who touched the hem of his garment and was healed. Then, Jesus arrived at the ruler's house, raised the daughter from death in Matthew 9:23 through 26. However, those events in the harmonies occur much later, after the Sermon on the Plain. So, what's going on? What do we do? We have to look at the connections between the puzzle pieces. For instance, the connecting phrase in Matthew 9:10 regarding the feast of Levi is, quote, and it came to pass. Well, that's not necessarily immediate. Mark 2:15 begins with the same words. So, in this case, we are saying that Luke, who usually is in chronological order, decided to go on a tangent and complete the thought brought up regarding Levi the tax collector, and so he brings in the feast at his house, which actually occurred chronologically later. This completes the subject of Levi. Reverend Cummins, in his book Acceptable Year of the Lord, states that, quote, this is one of the few places where the divinely inspired records in Mark and Luke momentarily digress from the chronology of events, unquote. So, Rood and Stalker follow Walter Cummins' lead, and so I'm going to do so too. So, the next event in the harmony that we're doing is event 4.19, the disciples eating grain on the Sabbath. So the next event chronologically is given in Luke when it returns to sequence after that tangent about the feast at Levi's house. And so we return to chronological order in Luke chapter 6, verse 1. However, at this point, we have a different problem, a textual error. Look at Luke chapter 6, verse 1. Luke chapter 6. Verse 1, and it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn, and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And certain of the Pharisees said to them, why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day? And Jesus answered them and said, haven't you read so much as this, what David did, when himself was hunger, and they which were with them? how he went into the house of God and take and eat of the showbread, and gave also to them that were with him, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priest alone. And then he said to them that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Oh, wow. Well, there's a textual variant there in verse 1 that is that second after the first. And the critical texts are not all in agreement whether that is genuine or not. Codex Alexandrinus has the unusual word deuteroprotos, second after the first. But the earlier manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus, see, now Alexandrinus is 5th century, Codex Sinaiticus is 4th century, Codex Vaticanus is 4th century, so it's earlier. Also, Papyrus 4 and Papyrus 75, both early papyruses, or papyri, if you want to be technical, omit it. So, I prefer to omit it too, because deuteroprotos is an unusual word, and it could have been a marginal note that was later incorporated into the text. See, you and I, we write our notes in the margins too, and there were monks that did that back then. So then, is that marginal note actually a marginal note, or is it a correction to the text? No, sometimes. So anyway, this could have been a marginal note that got incorporated into the text. Now, on the other hand, though, there is a rule in textual criticism, the detective work that they do to try to figure out which reading was the proper one. And that rule is, quote, the more difficult reading is usually the original. Why is that? Because they figured that scribes would be more apt to change difficult readings to smoother readings, so they would smooth things out. So the difficult reading would be more original. That's their theory. Now, some scholars who want to keep that deuteroprotos have suggested that it could refer to a week that had 2 Sabbath days in it. That is, a week that had a feast day that was designated as a Sabbath, followed by the regular Sabbath. However, the only feast that could be a candidate for that at this time would be Pentecost. Passover is totally out of the question. But we have already designated that the Pentecost week Sabbath was the date that Luke chapter 4 occurred, when Jesus taught in his home synagogue. That date was confirmed by the fact that Jesus read from Isaiah 61, which was scheduled for that date in the middle year of the 3-year pericope reading cycle. So, if we go with the recommendation of the UBS text and the 28th edition of the Nestle-Aland text, then it says that deuteroprotos is not in the text, and it eliminates the chronological problem. Also, when it comes to textual stuff like this, there is a commentary where the committee that put together the UBS texts has their arguments recorded. Bruce Metzger has a companion book to the UBS text titled A Textual Commentary on the New Testament, and he recorded the thoughts of the committee. And so he says, quote, in the opinion of a majority of the committee, although Sabbato deuteroproto is certainly the more difficult reading, it must not for that reason be adopted. The word deuteroprotos occurs nowhere else and appears to be a vox nulla. Interspersed Latin words. It's vox nulla means a useless or ambiguous statement that arose accidentally through a transcriptional blunder. Perhaps some copyists introduced proto as a correlative of en hetero sabbato, another Sabbath, in verse 6, and a second copyist, in view of 431, wrote deutero, deleting proto by putting dots over the letters. which was the customary way of canceling the word. Then he says, a subsequent transcriber, not noticing the dots, mistakenly combined the two words into one, which he introduced into the text. At that point on, it was included in the following generations of manuscripts. Now, I agree with that. I believe that Deuteroprotos should be omitted because it messes up the chronology. Mark chapter 2, verse 23 also records this event. Mark chapter 2, verse 23, came to pass as he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. So the Pharisees objected to that. All right. Another one is Matthew 12:1. Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. Matthew's out of chronological sequence. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered. And he began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But the Pharisees saw it, and they said to him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. And he said to them, haven't you read what David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him? Matthew 12:4, how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, because they're working and are blameless? But I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. Woo! But if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. There's a few things in this passage that need to be cleared up. One clue is in verse 5. The priests work in the temple on the Sabbath day, but they don't violate the law. Well, then, Jesus' workers were analogized to the priests. So, if there was this exception to that law, could there be more? Well, that's why Jesus said, verse 7, if you had known what this meant, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. So, there are situations where this can be countermanded. That's what verse 7 means. Wow. I mean, there was another situation in which the enemies of the Jews attacked them on the Sabbath day, and they believed they wouldn't fight back. Well, the first Sabbath day, they creamed them. But the next Sabbath day, fool me once, it's your fault. Fool me twice, it's my fault. Right? So the second Sabbath day that they tried the same trick, a high priest gave them a special dispensation to fight back, and their counterattack was so savage. They defeated the enemy, and they ultimately won their independence. Were they wrong to fight? Duh. An idealistic Pharisee might say, no, you gotta die. The Pharisee wouldn't say that if his life was at risk, I bet. So, this law was not absolute like the Pharisees insisted. There were appropriate exceptions. But even then, beyond that, Jesus was a Messiah. He was greater than the high priest. Like he said, there was one greater than the temple present. Woo! Well, one of his titles given in Genesis 49 was he was a lawgiver. That's right there in print. So, that needs to be cleared up and understood. Another thing, they were not eating corn as we know it. The word corn in King James days meant grain. This was in the late spring or early summer during the time of harvest, so it was barley or wheat. The Jews were instructed by the law to leave the corners of their fields unharvested so that the poor and needy could have something to eat. Ruth was afforded that same thing by Boaz and his workers. So this is what Jesus and his disciples were doing. So that clears up that event. Next event, 4.20. 4.20. Healing the man with the withered hand. And so this is Luke chapter 6, verse 6. And it came to pass on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees watched him, whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man which had the withered hand, Rise up, stand forth in the midst. And he arose and stood forth. And then said Jesus unto them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And looking round about on all them, he said to the man, Stretch forth your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored, whole as the other. Wow. Mark 3:1 is a familiar passage. Mark chapter 3, verse 1 is the same incident. And you get down to verse 5, and it says, And when he had looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their heart, he said to the man, Stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it out. And his hand was restored, whole as the other. So Matthew 12 also is the same event. Matt has a little bit more information. Matthew 12, verse 10. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep? And if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? Is that an exception? Well, it sounds like it to me. Well, how much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore is it lawful to do well on Sabbath days? And then he said unto them, Stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole as the other. See, this also is a classic example of who is responsible to believe. Both the healer and the healee need to believe. Believing is indicated by action. So, as the man acted on his believing to stretch out his hand, he was healed. It wasn't healed first and then he stretched it out. No. Sure, his hand was malformed and he could not stretch it out. But if he didn't believe he could do it, he wouldn't even have tried. But he believed and he tried to stretch it out, and that was all it took on his part. Jesus' part was to believe too and declare what the will of God was. So we have to speak boldly, all right, but both have to believe. See, sure, a healing a withered hand may seem to be impossible, but if God says so, then we just speak it boldly, because whatever God says is going to happen. So we have to declare it and believe, and then it happens. Next event 4.21. The Pharisees conspire against Jesus. Immediately after this healing of the withered man's hand, in Luke 6:11, they were filled with madness and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. Mark 3:6. After the same incident, the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Well, the Pharisees hated the Herodians. All right? Now, Herod had imprisoned John the Baptist. So, the Pharisees took the unusual step to conspire with Herod's allies, people they despised. But Jesus became aware of that unholy alliance. Matthew chapter 12, verse 15. Matthew 12:15. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from thence. Next event 4.22. 4.22, which is Mark chapter 3, verse 7. Mark chapter 3, verse 7. But Jesus withdrew himself with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and from beyond Jordan, and they about Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude. So people are starting to assemble from all over. And when they had heard what great things he did, came unto him. And he spake to his disciples that a small ship should wait on him because of the multitude, lest they should throng him. For he had healed many, insomuch that they pressed upon him for to touch him, as many as had plagues and unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell down before him and cried, saying, Thou art the Son of God. And he straitly charged them that they should not make him known. Matthew 12:15 also talks about this. Matthew 12:15b. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. And he charged them that they should not make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. Spiritual firework, saying, Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall show judgment to the Gentiles. Even those guys from Tyre and Sidon. He shall not strive nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. He's not going to call attention to himself like the Pharisees did. A bruised reed shall he not break, and a smoking flax shall he not quench, till he sent forth judgment unto victory, and in his names shall the Gentiles trust. Now, there are a few expressions here that need explanation. He shall not strive nor cry. The consensus in the commentaries is that Jesus was not ostentatious. He didn't commend himself or praise himself. He was of modest deportment. Well, that fits with the fact that he, quote, charged them that they should not make him known. Jesus was not after fame and glory. You know, one of the temptations of successful leaders is that power can get to their head, and so they got to stay meek and humble by all means. If they fail to do so, it will lead to their downfall. Then the other phrases, the interpretation of the bruised reed reference, if you look at the commentaries, that's all over the map. They're guessing. They don't know. But I trust Pillai's teaching on it because he was an expert on biblical culture. And according to Bishop Pillai, the bruised reed illustration was an expression of resilience, because the reeds that are spoken of would bow down in the heat of the day, but then in the evening they would rise back up. And they persisted. They didn't break. So that was a picture of resilience. Then, the smoking flax shall not he not quench, Pillai says, was an idiom meaning that Jesus would be diligent and not lazy. Pillai explained that homes were lit by olive oil lamps, and when the lamp ran out of oil, the flax wick would start to smoke. Well, Pillai explains that a diligent wife would not let it go out, but she would refill the lamp with oil. So there may be other references to this that some of you know. I just trust Pillai because of his biblical culture understanding. All right, the next event, and this is the last event of our teaching in this session, is event 4.23. 4.23. The ordination of the 12 apostles. Matthew 9:35. Matthew chapter 9:35. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. That's like a summary verse. It could occur at any time. But verse 36, when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them. There's compassion again. Because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who's called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, also Luke 6:12 talks about the same event. Luke 6:12. It came to pass in those days that he went up into a mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And then when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. So then it names the 12. And then Mark chapter 3, verse 13 is another listing of the same. This was a milestone in the ministry of Jesus. In order to go to the next level of expansion, there now will be 12 more spark plugs, and Jesus gave them power. This was not the same flavor of Holy Spirit that the Old Testament believers had. It was not the same as we have in the church today. In my One Spirit of Original Christianity class, I teach about the 7 traits of the Spirit, and these may change at dispensational milestones. Remember, Jesus said, he is with you and shall be in you. That was coming, see, at a dispensational milestone, a change. Well, the apostles got the same kind of Holy Spirit that Jesus had. Well, how do I know that? Because of the communicable trait of the Spirit. An example of that is God took of the Spirit that was on Moses and gave it to the 70. The same is now with Christ in us, the communicable trait of Spirit. So, same was true in the Gospels. The apostles got what Jesus had. That Spirit was conditional, like in the Old Testament, but it was not portioned. They got all of it. And it was exclusive to the believers that it had been given to. Not all believers had it, like we have in our administration. And it was transformative. They did not have a way to edify it in the gospel administration, so it came full strength. The apostles did spiritual exploits right away, full on, pedal to the metal, full horsepower. Woo! And it had the same 7 categories or manifestations as in the Old Testament. At the administration change, at Pentecost, then it changed. The apostles were about to go out 2 by 2 into the cities that Jesus would visit later, so they broke ground for Jesus. Jesus' ministry was about to take a huge leap. But before that, Jesus would teach the Sermon on the Plain, which we will cover in the next session. So bless you.